Coproduction, which is a project I'm currently working on, sponsored by or paid for by the UK Climate Resilience Network. And the other project is the Blue-Green Infrastructure and Social Innovation Project, which is paid for by the EU's Interreg. And basically both projects are concerned with getting people, local people, involved in creating green infrastructure or designing green infrastructure. And one of the reasons that I wanted to interview Sue was because it seemed to me that Green Estate was already doing this and had been doing this for years, and therefore had some really relevant input to bring to the project. So what was my final preliminary? If you want to be on the Magic mailing list, would you write something? Would you just put your name and email address in the chat, and we will add you to the Magic mailing list and inform you of future events? Okay, I think that's everything I wanted to say. So welcome, Sue. Lovely to have you here. So as a starting point, I thought it would be useful if you could explain when and how did Green Estate get started?
Thanks, Liz. Okay, hello everybody. Lovely to kind of sort of see you. Well, I suppose you've got to imagine back in, it actually had early roots right back in the 1980s, in a particular neighbourhood in Sheffield, which had been completely and utterly decimated by, basically, I mean, it was the steel industry collapse. You know, we're talking about one of the largest in the country interwar housing estates, garden estates, built on garden estate principles, but like lots of garden estates, pretty failed design really, because it didn't actually take through a lot of the ideas that, you know, you create these new communities, but you actually also provide, you know, the means to work there as well, and all the other infrastructure. So yeah, collapse of the steel industry, mass unemployment, a whole community devastated, 20,000 households basically living in pretty dire poverty, in an incredibly denuded environment, you know, with all the multiple problems you actually get. And there was a sort of a bottom-up approach, I think, really. It was one of the very, very few regeneration projects or programs in the UK, and probably internationally, but certainly from the UK, that was not council-led. It was led by, at the time, community activists, but that did something quite unique, which they put a strategy together. You know, that's also quite unusual. So there were some quite articulate people there, quite passionate, had long-term relationships, and they put a strategy together, multifaceted strategy, of which one of the strands was environment. And that was really, really important. So there was the, you know, community and work and employment and schools and training and education, but environment came out. And in this instance, the environment meant green spaces, as opposed to just dog poo and better lighting. Yeah. And a lot of the other kind of environmental projects were much more focused on, you know, just clean up the rubbish. So this was an appreciation that the area had a huge amount of green space, 600 odd hectares of public open space, all in a terrible, terrible state, but with an amazing potential, to be honest.
So this was the neighbourhood around Manor S2 in
That's
Sheffield.
correct. Yeah, it was the wards of Manor and Castle at the time. S2, 10,000 households, 20,000 people, all quite monolithic, but with this amazing, amazing green space resource. And that's really how it all started. This group came together. They managed to somehow wangle single regeneration budget funding, and it was with an interrelated program. And I came in to run a one-year project at the time, which was to basically develop an environmental regeneration project. And that's the very start of it, back in 1999. Yeah, seems a scary long time ago.
Fantastic. And I first came across the project when you, in relation to the placement of ponds in the Manor Park. Could you tell people a little bit about that project, how that was part of it?
Well, I think when we looked at the environment, we were really looking to see how, in a sense, the land, the green infrastructure could actually make a transformational difference in a city estate. There's a lot of interest been in looking more recently at green infrastructure, probably on a much wider scale, but at a neighbourhood level, how do you actually make 600 hectares of public open space actually valuable? and actually sort of performing a function. So one of the things we did to start with, we looked at all those elements of why it was dysfunctioning and how that it might actually serve a purpose. And there was many strands to this, but one of the things we actually looked at right at the early days, of course, was actually how the landscape would provide the sort of ecosystem services, which is a byword now, but certainly wasn't at the time. And there's a whole series of how particularly sustainable urban drainage came about. But not only did we have this environmental regeneration program, we also had a very, very significant housing development program. And so we're talking about, I can't remember the numbers, but there was at least 2,000 new homes that had to be built in this neighbourhood. So lots and lots of green space, very, very underused. 2,000 or so new homes. Immediately it sprang to mind was actually how could the landscape actually work with housing development, and in particular, how could it form a service? And there was no doubt in my mind too that not only were we thinking about actually how could you beautify these places, find the capital funding for it, have a long-term solution, but also how could you actually lever in the cash through different ways, to actually build stuff. And that's really was the starting point. I mean, it was quite convoluted about how it all came about, but it was the real starting point about how and why we should really particularly look at stormwater management in the open spaces on the manor.
So how did things shift then from being part of a community-led regeneration project to you becoming a social enterprise? You talked about some sort of crisis as being leading to that.
I think right at the very beginning, even the partnership itself, there was 7 themes and sort of seven leaders of that. So I was the leader of the environmental theme, but most of us were professional of some sort anyway. So whilst it was a kind of a bottom-up approach, there were professionals, and it was all interwoven with from everything from the health authority to local authority to community activists. So there was a lot of partnership working, but yes, we were happily sort of delivering a project which we thought would first of all come to an end after 12 months. When we submitted a nice little set of ideas. After that, we managed to lever in enough finances to actually do a 4-year, almost like development program, which in itself really kind of worked on those partnerships and levering in more cash, and also started some of the physical change and some of the political challenge, particularly around new approaches to land development and management. But yeah, we were happily steaming along in a lovely direction, thinking that all the housing was going to be transferred actually to the local development trust, and we would be the land management agency with oodles of money pouring through, to sustain us long term in basically managing what we'd already started to coin as the green estate. The kind of concept of the green estate was it was going to be the Chatsworth of the inner city, basically. You take the idea of a really kind of productive estate elsewhere, and you go, right, you can still do this in an inner city if you think about it in those terms. Anyway, it all basically went pear-shaped. There was a risk aversion to this notion of housing being transferred to a development trust, and we were suddenly left with this thing about being also halfway through a really, really expansive program of site development and absolutely no ongoing revenue. I think the revenue for one of these parks that we were creating, Manor Park, which is a 22-hectare supposedly district park, needed £4 million to build, and the revenue budget from the Parks Fund was £400 a year. Yeah. So yeah, we were suddenly absolutely stuck there and thought, crikey, what on earth are we going to do? We either just walk away and leave a community even more devastated than it was before, with lots of promises and lots of ideas, just starting to get confidence up, lots of partnerships starting to work, lots of great ideas, or we have to find another route. So the other route was we looked at all the skills we actually had and started to basically sell them elsewhere, on the basis that if we could sustain ourselves and we could carry on working in this field, we could also carry on being and pushing the whole agenda for environmental regeneration in the neighbourhood. And 21 years on, we're sort of still here.
So can you just reiterate what those skills were and are?
Well, I mean, I came in from a landscape background, a landscape and education. So I suppose I had kind of people in place at the heart of what I was doing. I mean, we twinned quite early on with the University of Sheffield in terms of their landscape department. So there was always a kind of a close affinity there in terms of new approaches. But yeah, I suppose one of the big things we did was we levered in regeneration funding of all varied sorts to rebuild some of the parks. And rather than just contracting this out to a company in Leeds or London or something like that, we actually employed kids from the estate right at the very beginning, and then brought in professional landscape people, some of which are both the kids and the professionals are still with us today, on the basis that we would build the parks ourselves. And through doing that, what we did was we acquired. Well, first of all, we actually got an awful lot of buy-in from the community, because instead of actually trashing parks, people started to realise that they were their potential income source in the future. And we actually had our kids defending the parks against, a lot more antisocial behaviour. And that's gone on from strength to strength. But also we acquired a reputation and a set of skills. And basically that money is the whole thing you do in regeneration. You try and recycle money as many times in your neighbourhood as you possibly can. It's the whole thing about the leaky colander. So, and that's what we did. And through that process, we ended up with a pretty skilled landscape team, which now only diversified. There's lots of things we do. We've run everything. We've run everything from a cheese factory to a tree nursery to crikey, we've recycled just about everything you can want to imagine. But everything was all really about the land. It was about what you could do with the land. But the landscape skills are still at the core of it. But we run an international business growing, selling a product called Pictorial Meadows. We grow a flower turf across Europe now in three, 5 sites. We recycle green waste. We make soil substrates. We run a visitor centre, which attracts people from even America. We did before COVID. There's weddings going on site yesterday, and there's a wake tomorrow, and education services. So you just think of the Chatsworth of the inner city. That's who we are now. That's how we make our money.
Fantastic. Okay, so can I just come back to this issue about why did you become a social enterprise? What brought that about?
Well, we became a social enterprise because, I mean, at the foundation of most social enterprises, not every single one, but certainly, there's a problem to solve which either the public sector or the private sector can't actually address. The social enterprises sort of live on the fringes of viability, really. So we had a choice between. We could have become a charity, but that really wasn't what we wanted to be. It wasn't a begging bowl act, and we couldn't walk away. So the idea of a social enterprise is you basically are an enterprise. You're a business, you're a commercial entity that makes money, but all of your profit goes back to your social purpose. And in our case, therefore, our social purpose was the green spaces of S2, to make sure that in perpetuity the assets that have been built up would be sustained and maintained, and that people could enjoy them and people could have access to them. But there's a kind of a longer term thread in that too, about making sure that we could push the boundaries really around different forms of green urban greening. So there's a kind of an angle on that as well about, yes, you can have nature rich solutions. You can have water storage in your inner cities. You can change the way that actually our landscapes look and work. And this is welcomed in, across the spectrum of society as well. I might not have answered your question, Liz. I might have wandered off the point then and got into a little bit of a rant. I don't know.
I mean, so I think you've kind of answered why you wanted it to be a social enterprise.
Yeah.
And that you've specified that the funds that are made out of all of these activities you're doing go back into helping S2 for the most. But maybe can you tell us just a little bit more about, well, how did that process of becoming a social enterprise happen? What were the steps in that process?
Yeah, I mean, back to the answer about why social enterprise. I mean, you cannot sustain something of this kind through grants. That's absolutely, no one was going to fund us at all. And you can't sustain an estate essentially and this kind of stuff through grants. So there was absolutely no choice apart from being a social enterprise. And we had to make money, and we had to make enough money, and the work we had to do had to be so closely aligned to our social purpose that we had lots of experts, and that's a really good thing. I mean, that's one of the things that's been successful, is that we've attracted people who are, are professional landscape architects, professional landscape managers, passionate about this kind of thing. And whilst 3/4 of the time they're out making money, 1/4 of the time they're kind of sharing their knowledge, passion, and expertise. So a social enterprise model is a really good model if you want to do big stuff and you want to do big scale change, really, and you don't want to be putting out your begging bowl. Sometimes just funding with grants is much more energy. Most of your energy goes into trying to get the grant and then finding it's not quite what you want to do, and you start to wander off the point. Whereas if you just make money and spend it, you can do what you want, basically. And yeah, the actual process was we sort of we basically thought about the kind of organisation we wanted to be at the time, and when we literally went to the solicitors who were really looking at this whole third sector, and we just explained exactly what we wanted, and they came up with a structure that suited. We had a bit of a dodgy few years. It's a really difficult transition from a grant funded organisation to 100% commercial funded organisation. It was a tough transition. You lose a lot of staff who are very passionate in the process, and you have to take on a lot of staff who have got really good commercial skills, but they all want a company car, which isn't quite the social enterprise model. And yeah, somewhere in the process, you lose the plot a little bit. But, it is an interesting transition, but I won't bore you with that. That's for anyone who's really into social enterprise.
Okay, so you made that transition. Could you tell us a little bit about what your focus is now?
Well, yes, lovely. So Green Estate currently employs about 45 staff. In fact, we've been probably fairly consistent for quite a long time now. We've got about a turnover of about £2.5 million, and are as resilient as you possibly can be. In the circumstances. Who knows what's going to happen in the next few years? We've done a lot of work in the last 2 years through COVID and the pandemic, really thinking about where we want to go. Actually, we have accepted the fact that our role in regeneration is over, and we've built parks and we've built partnerships, and there's lots of ideas out there. But this kind of concept of sort of reimagine nature, bringing nature back into cities, but making nature really acceptable, and I mean really acceptable to the everyday person that is not an ecologist or fascinated by little brown flowers. So we have come up with a new vision, mission, purpose, and it is all about the built environment. It's all about carrying on working in that environment, but also increasing our capacity to share good practice, really. To show, demonstrate, inspire, on workable solutions. So we're going to keep this around the landscape theme, around the urban landscape theme, but really to be able to create a sort of using all the sites we've got and our partner sites to bring people to Sheffield to show how this works. In many cases, I think people have been at the heart of this, but also how people react and respond. Because I think with a lot of specifiers, if they've not actually worked in anything, engineers that haven't worked maybe with green engineering, specifiers that don't really understand maybe what the choices are. There's a lot of fear about doing anything new. And I think if people can actually see, touch, feel and hear what other people say, there's a lot more confidence. So we want to become a conduit really for more practice-based learning.
So would it be fair to say then that your social goal has shifted because you have this sense of having achieved the regeneration of S2, that area is now flourishing, and therefore your primary goal now is perhaps reaching out perhaps to the whole of Sheffield, but also not just that, more conceptually to promoting let's say a landscape and water management led regeneration on a much broader basis across the world.
I think that's perfectly correct, Liz. Yeah, absolutely spot on. I mean, for a long time, our commercial activities which have centered around things like green roofs, suds, more naturalistic planting, have been national anyway. And through those processes, through working with things like local authorities up and down the country and with other organisations, we've been able to sort of share ideas and obviously learn as well. So we've always had this, really for the last 10, 15 years, but increasing the last few years, a much, much wider appeal. And a much wider reach, but we've not had it in a very structured way. It's literally been, we get a contract, we go and we try and do the best we can. It's trying to maybe capture some of that and to have it much more accessible. Even if people come to visit us, it literally has to be one of us that takes people around. There isn't like a place you can come or something you can get to online, or a way that maybe if you come through to one of us, you link to something else. So the whole thing about things like the whole living with water, we were talking to Yorkshire Water about that. We were very, very excited about that, thinking, the stuff that's been developed there is so complementary, but no one in Sheffield might know about it, or likewise. And if other places can see the two together and they can see, and we can piggyback on each other, those kinds of things. So it's not just about what we do, it's about also trying to form those links that expand the accessibility, I think, to others. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. So I've reached, well, I suppose just maybe you could reflect a little bit on what you see then as the key kind of challenges for the next few years. I'm aware of kind of how, is there ever a kind of tension between, on the one hand, the sort of money-making aspects and the commitment aspects?
Well, no, definitely there is. I mean, I think whatever happens, however, unless you're directly funded for exactly what you do, there is always a conflict. There are some benefits in that it makes you think on your feet and be quite creative and active, because again, if you're not delivering to customers and clients, you're not actually doing anything that's probably very, very useful. So there are some positives, but yeah, there's definitely conflicts. My goodness, yeah, I could go on about risks and downsides for a very long time. There's a lot of them. Risk itself is a scary thing. Yeah, any kind of a risk, and I think that's been one of the things that we found that. When we very first started, I just think again about the very first SUD scheme, which is amazing. We've now got, there's a lot of SUD schemes across Sheffield now. A lot of them, but they all started with one particular one where we must have lobbied for 2 years to get this scheme in. It made enormous sense. But the risk for the engineers and the lack of concept of that at the time was so alien. And they just wanted to quickly get something done and shove it in a pipe and, what have you. And it was only when that project went completely pear-shaped and they got all the calculations wrong and discovered they were like a metre out in terms of levels and it was going to cost them £2 million to remedy, they suddenly turned around and sort of said, can we pour it into the park instead? But since then, the minute that happened, and it wasn't the most perfect scheme, retrofitting projects isn't, but that shared learning made the next project easier, the next project easier, the next project easier. So I think, I think we've learned that risk is scary for people. Partnerships, if you don't have partnerships, if you can't work across the spectrum, a lot of these things are multi-agency, multifaceted. We're dealing with quite complex things. There isn't a particular profession called green infrastructure, professionals. There's a lot of different people, planners, the landscape architects, landscape managers, engineers, it just goes on, flood water, management agencies, countryside, so unless we work together, and a lot, you just don't get anything done at all. And then it's time. A lot of these things they take a long time. You might be working on something that goes dormant because of lack of resources, or the thing is just not quite there. And you have to be terribly persistent. So you really have to keep going.
Okay, so my final question, and before I ask it, I'd like to invite members of the audience to put questions in the chat. But my final question then is, what, let's say, 3 pieces of advice would you give to a potential social enterprise hoping to start off promoting living with water in Hull?
Okay, get a really good business idea to start with. You need something to sell. that someone's going to buy. And so you really do need, ideally, to have a really good business idea. Number 2, be prepared not to sleep at night for 20 odd years, because, and to give 20 odd years. So don't do this flippantly. If you're going to set up a social enterprise, you have to do it for passion, and because you genuinely believe in the cause. So brilliant business idea. You've got to stick with it. Make as many friends and relationships as you possibly can, because it'll be through those partnerships that you will affect change, and they will make things easier for you. Without those, you're very lonely.
Okay, fantastic. Now I'm going to have a look at the chat. I haven't seen any questions popping in there so far. Okay, well, if as we haven't got them, people are still reflecting. I shall ask another question then. I have a dream. I have a dream about, I haven't made calculations as to whether it's a sensible or stupid dream, but basically using rain tanks and rain gardens across Sheffield to hold the water back, to stop some of the risks of flooding, for example, around the station, and also addressing the risks of CSO spills. Would Green Estate like to be part of my dream? How can we make it happen?
Well, first of all, I think we should sit down and do some number crunching. I think it's a brilliant idea, and I think it's got a real good potential business base. So I think it would be fantastic to actually just look to see what that business model, basically, how are we going to make the damn things, and how are we going to sell and market them? And if we think that can work and that it can stack up, on its own, in a sense, without the need. I mean, we might want to go for grant funding to actually kickstart something like this, and there is quite a lot of help to start something off. But if it looks like it's a viable model, then the next thing, of course, is you basically put a business plan for a business is much simpler often than a business plan for a grant. It starts with an Excel spreadsheet, I always think. It's about, can we get this going? How can we do it with obviously if you get hold of lots and lots of money, it's great. But normally we start a lot of things on peanuts, quite frankly. So you look at actually how you can go into that small scale manufacturing and scale up as quickly as you can. Lowest risk. I love it and would be dead interested in being involved.
Fantastic. We shall continue this conversation. Yeah. Okay, so Beth, could I invite you to ask your question?
Yes, of course, and thank you very much. It's really great to hear the interview. So I've been doing some work with a primary school in Arbourthorne Community Primary School, and they have a vision to try and think about what their role in the community might be. And particularly, they're very well endowed with grounds around the school, and they've used them to really good effect. So there's like different gardening projects, there's a community fridge, there's a polytunnel. They've just been working with others in Arbourthorne around the pond. They've been working with architecture students at the university to develop a healthy hideout space where they can do outdoor lessons and stuff. And I was wondering 2 questions really. How you've worked in Manor and Castle, how you've worked with schools, whether they've been part of this, and also where you see the possibility for cross-ward or cross-area learning. So I was really struck by what you were saying towards the end, really, about the absence of mechanisms to do that. And I suppose my third bit of the question is whether or not the need for survival and generate grant income can actually hinder those kinds of collaborations across boundaries, because there's just not always enough money to go around. I'm going to mute again, I'm afraid, because I have to pick up my daughter soon, but I'm still here listening.
Forget question 3, but yeah, fantastic question. In our very early days, when we were grant funded, we worked with all the schools, all the local schools, on anything that was environmental that actually they really wanted, because we wanted to encourage all of that kind of stuff. As time went on, we moved to this formal education, and because we'd just taken over the Sheffield Manor Lodge site, all of our education became heritage. And we started to realise that more recently there's been this total divorce, that all our education and our visitor appeal has been related to Mary Queen of Scots, and however fascinating that is, and it is fascinating, it was absolutely nothing to do with actually what we were really interested in. So part of this whole revisioning that we've been doing is wanting to get back to some of that grassroots stuff as well. And in particular, engage the youth of Sheffield in how they want to actually have their city in the future. So, and to turn our education emphasis again back to urban wilding and green space and environmental projects. So we used to do it, we haven't done it, we want to do it in the future. And yes, how we collaborate now is a bit restricted because we've sort of honed down our education team and certainly our outreach team, but it would be great to have that conversation, because we're now wanting to actually reach out and have those conversations with exactly yourselves and the schools again, to go, okay, how should we be shaping this place up, this kind of centre up? That might be a virtual centre, of virtual learning. It might be collaboration. It might be physical resources. Obviously, we want to marry as much as we can with the curriculum, so that, because trips of any sort are, the most successful ones are where you can walk to the place, and it doesn't cost anything. But also, I think some of these themes, I mean, on the water theme, for instance, I mean, we've been working on new narratives that we want to build more wider education around, and particularly again the water is one of those themes. Food is another one, urban growing, wildlife in your cities. So we've got these themes, and it would be really great to actually sort of to talk about these a little bit more. We've just we've submitted a bit to Heritage Lottery as well. So if we were successful with that, that will be the impetus for a big 4-year project that will have a massive focus on young people in Sheffield as well, having a say, a voice, and an influence on their city. I don't know if I answered, but it's my best attempt.
Brett's final question there was about, does sometimes grant funding create barriers to interprofessional and interdisciplinary collaboration?
Definitely. I mean, obviously grant funding can be a great boon. I mean, we still try and get grant funding for specific things, but I think it makes you chase grants for the sake of the grant, and it takes your focus off what you really want to do. However, it's a difficult world, isn't it? And resources are few and far between. So I think it's better to focus on what you really want to do in the collaborations and try and find other mechanisms. And if grants part of that mix, that's great. But yeah, I think they're a bit of a dangerous route, bit of a red herring.
Now let's move on to Ruth's question, who asks, over the past 20 years, have you seen a shift towards SUDS? Where do you think SUDS and Green Estate will be in the next 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we've broken the back, I think. I mean, Sheffield's done a huge amount. And I think the fact that it's had actually, I mean, we were very lucky in Sheffield that when we started it in Manor Fields, it was all new. Then Roger Noel, who was actually the Parks Development Officer with us at the time, went back to work for the council and then went into the in the planning department and particularly the water management and led on the flood management. And he developed quite an international reach, really. And so lots of projects have followed, and then in particular things like the Greater Green Scheme in Sheffield, which was led by again the design team in the planning department. Incredibly innovative, but to sort of show that Sheffield was looking at both the whole water catchment of the whole of the Sheffield region, but right through to actually looking at SUDS in the inner cities. I think what we've actually got now, and people from all over the world have come to see this, and that's quite powerful, really. They look at it, they try and replicate it, it gives them confidence. So I think we'll see a huge acceleration. I think, the scheme's now popping up all over the place. There's still a bit of a challenge about management. I think there's always a lot of excitement about building something, and there's a lot of costing goes in for building. There's very rarely any funding going for management. But yeah, it's exploded in terms of, I think, the technological knowledge, the sharing, the realization that actually you make cost savings, and actually managing a swale is pretty damn easy. There was a lot of fear to start with, that somehow a swale was a scary thing because it wasn't a pipe, but actually grass is quite easy to look after,
Ruth, do you want to come back on any of that?
No, but thank you for the great answer in the talk.
Excellent. Okay, so can I invite Kate Lonsdale then to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. So yeah, I'm also a Sheffield resident, but I have done sort of, I used to live in Oxford, and we did quite a lot of community development type work. So my question was really about bringing, working with groups. Some groups are very easy to work with, they're very accessible, and some groups are kind of, I hate the word harder to reach, but because it's just about finding the places where they are. But sort of, I just wondered if you had a thing to say about how you'd worked with different types of communities, how you engage them in this work.
I mean, to be frank about it, everything was hard to reach when we started. I mean, really hard to reach. People were battered so low that we could do things like all the traditional things like standing, giving freebies out, doing big events, and nobody would engage at all. I can remember doing our very first planning for real, and people would just literally walk past, and you'd be talking about green spaces, and they'd be going, "Well, I don't even recognise it." So yeah, hard to reach. So longevity. So what are all our business success? We moved into the neighbourhood. We were professionals, and that's always a bit of a scary thing, but we moved in and we committed to the place. So we occupied every rundown place in the entire neighbourhood, from the hairdressers, the post office, the old shop. We just lived there, and we've lived there ever since. We employed local people. We employed the hardest to reach group at the time, which was young unemployed men. And that had a big impact, actually employing people and getting through the families, and that's still been a big thread. Delivering. You have to deliver, and it's not until you've done and affected change that people will come with you. And that takes a long time because you've actually got to do something. But and then that physical change or whatever makes a difference in itself. And I can remember the very first time, and it has to have been probably 8 years in. 8 years of absolutely having every event we did, everything got nicked. Things would get stolen. Things would just, no one would talk to us. You just had to kind of almost blind faith. And the first event where we suddenly looked around, and the kids were all just suddenly saying please and thank you and queuing up nicely. Really, really interesting shift. And since then, you start to notice other things. Suddenly, so there's something about time. You have to give it time. You have to be committed. You have to show you're in it for the long term. You have to try every single approach. Definitely try food. Give food away. Yeah, every bit of food you can. Always have a cafe. Always give out free food. Never give up.
Brilliant.
Few tips.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so Patrick Harrison, you've got a question. I invite you to ask it.
Hello, thank you for a good talk. So I'm working on a project in southeast Sheffield, looking at trying to develop an urban wildlife corridor, linking ecology to health and education in that area. So it's meant to go from what is going to be left of Althorpe Fields all the way down to Bait, and running through some areas which are probably high on the indices of deprivation, a bit like Manor Castle in ways. So I'm from the area as well. So I went to, my parents still live there, so I'm connected to the area. I was wondering, in terms of the financial aspects of it, have you had much luck in terms of developing partnerships to deliver, for example, social prescribing, activities through NHS partnerships or whatnot? If so, how did you go around that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Patrick, I think we've worked on every kind of funding stream going. In particular, I would say probably in the very early days there were some glimmerings of hope, but I think probably organisations like things like the Wildlife Trust have probably scooped those ones up. What small amount is actually going, they've sort of got them. Even sort of Parks Department and what have you. We scraped together bits and pieces. We'd have some very short-term funding, but. Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons we turned to the social enterprise model, and having to it's what I call the Robin Hood model. We make our money down in southeast London and bring it back to Manor, because quite frankly, we couldn't find the way to make money from activities on those green spaces alone. Of course, your other model is a purely volunteer-led model. We kind of went down the professional route, and there's a big question about, which route you should go down, because there have been incredibly successful things if you're not too ambitious. If it's all about maybe trying to keep one person going that's a linchpin, doing things through volunteers and partnerships. But yeah, it's a real struggle. I can't pretend it's easy. I wish I could give more hope. I really do.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, Christine, do you want to ask your question?
Just find my microphone. And yeah, Sue, you are I mean, I'm not wanting to embarrass you, you're very impressive, and you have obviously been in there from the beginning, and you talk about how important it is to make relationships across the board, and with partnerships and everybody. Realize I'm speaking to you without my face, which is, there you go. So I'm gesticulating like mad, and obviously it's going nowhere. So the organisation is really. How much do you think rests on you now? And if you, God forbid, anything which should happen to you, or you suddenly find something else that you want to do, is there some way that you've got of handing it on to somebody? I'm interested in this because I quite often see really successful organisations, especially very much more activist or community-led stuff like yours, projects like yours. They are kind of personality held.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. I mean, so you're exactly right in the problem. There's a whole series of social enterprises and as you say, other organisations which have been driven for quite a long time by a particular person, and so succession planning has become a major issue for us because we're all reaching a certain age. And in fact, I've just handed my notice in. So we have been planning for the last 3 years around succession to create, and a big part of our new vision, mission, and purpose, and building a professional team has been absolutely to do this, to make sure that it is embedded absolutely throughout the company and the organisation, that it makes perfect sense, and that there is a very, very strong body of people to take it on. So it is a real concern. There's many organisations in a very similar situation, and we all absolutely have to look at how that can be managed. Yeah. So ask that question in a year's time, and we'll see how it's going.
I'm watching this because I really love it. I love everything that you were saying. I absolutely agree with you about feeding everybody, and also being prepared to take the kind of, it's the long haul. And that's, I think, where you say about funding often just completely misses that you need longevity with these things to gain the trust of a community. You can't just pop in and pop out again. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got a question from Ed Rollison. Do you want to ask it, Ed?
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, that was a great talk, Sue. Thank you very much. I'm just about to start a project looking at retrofitting of SUDs and sort of community-driven green infrastructure in a much higher density urban area. It doesn't kind of benefit from having 600 hectares of open land to play with. I suppose, what would be your kind of key lessons for sort of landscape management planning for areas that perhaps don't benefit from the open space that you've got?
Well, I mean, there's a whole variety of other ways you can actually do this. I think, it's a great chance to actually intensify and beautify a much more intensive scheme. I mean, obviously, big expansive areas, with huge capacity are probably actually easier to manage and probably cheaper to manage. But you can get fabulous schemes which have got multi-purpose and multi-benefits. The big key thing I would say is obviously, design becomes absolutely all important, and really making sure that it has got a multiplicity of use. So it needs to combine play. It certainly needs to combine, it needs to be your green space where everyone sits and relaxes. So beauty and thinking about your long-term management budget. Yeah. Beauty, play, leisure, all of those things, but you can absolutely do things on incredibly small scales. But you just need to, so the design needs to be right. Obviously your calculations need to be right as well. But just make sure you get that multifaceted value out of it, because essentially those green streets or what have you, those much more intensive schemes, will become the places that people are actually going to be enjoying and sitting around. And I think that's for many of us. I mean, this is what our cities are going to be like. We need to maximise those grey spaces. And basically turn them into something that is going to be, beautiful, functional, and recreational.
So Ed, do you want to follow up on that?
No, thank you. That was great. Thanks very much.
Fantastic.
Can I just ask whether, I'm not sure where you're based, but if you have you been in Sheffield City Centre and seen the Greater Green Scheme recently?
No, I'm based up in Teesside and the northeast. I've actually never been to Sheffield ever.
Okay. If you send me a thing, I'll send you some photographs because it's inspirational how this has been retrofitted into an incredibly tight environment, but is stunning and it's changed the patterns of use. It deals with a lot of the flood management from the city centre and around the ring road, but also it has just transformed a completely rundown a whole series of neighbourhoods and transformed all of the offices and working environments around it. So yeah, give us your email and I'll send you a few images. And if you're ever in Sheffield, give us a shout.
That would be amazing. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've come to the end of the questions in the chat. So I've got one more question, and we'll see whether any others emerge from the chat, but we might draw it to a close fairly soon. So if you could give some comments to government, if you could sit down with somebody senior in DEFRA or indeed the Department of Communities and Local Government, and say what you want from them. What are your requests? What are your policy changes that you want to happen?
Well, I suppose a lot of it is in actual new developments, isn't it? I've seen so many schemes fail that had great ambitions, great planning policy to start with, probably sometimes some really good landscape architects working with it, but all of it engineered out. There is a huge dislike by housing developers to spend a penny more than they actually have to, and particularly with the issues of long-term management. So I don't know. I wish I had the easy answer to this, but I suppose it is in some ways it is about taking that long-term view, isn't it? Which we haven't got much hope with planning policy at the moment, really. But that's if you're going to want successful communities and you're going to want ecosystem services embedded into your city, you have to take a strategic, planning-led, very strong planning-led and followed through approach. And if you're going to jettison that, so I suppose it's empowering really, really good planning policy at a kind of a city level. Making sure that is resourced and continue to educate people that are going to actually feel that they want worthwhile jobs in this and to stay with it, because quite frankly we've lost so many good people recently, the very people that would have actually helped to see some of these schemes through. So you don't get sustainable communities, and you don't get non-flooded cities and all of the other kind of stuff and green spaces to go and enjoy when you've got the next pandemic, unless you've got long-term planning. And for that, you need strong planning policy and really, really good people in there.
So, I get the feeling that strong planning policy, better funded planning departments that are allowed to plan strategically for multiple functions.
Yeah.
These are things which it seems unlikely this government is about to deliver for you.
No, that's so sad. So I don't think I'm going to actually go and lobby, because I think I'll be just there with my little placard. Well, the other thing, I'm just going to sneak around, and anybody that wants to do a project, we're just going to get on and do something. So that's been part of our approach. Is we failed quite seriously on anything big. It's been by doing stuff at a local level and making it work somehow. That somehow seems to have had more impact at the end of the day, and hopefully there's someone who is more articulate and in the me, and a more sympathetic government. We'll have to do
it seems like what you've done is you've carved out a niche in which you can make stuff happen, and you've made it happen, and that's actually really amazing. And really impressive. Now, something that I'm going to kind of ask Christine's question, another question from Christine here, because I think, so Christine's asking, have you ever had or promoted to develop schemes which are about members of the public doing stuff on their own houses and in their own land, rather than doing things in the public realm?
Yeah, early days, and certainly in previous jobs, I think people's gardens, play a fundamental part. So just very simple things you can do in a neighbourhood is just literally encourage even things like competitions. So you can we've done things like gardening support, we've done things like almost like ranges of almost like build your own garden, but how can you make those small changes? Definitely actually almost like doing a garden ranger service where you're out there actually working very, very direct with anybody that wants to do something. We've tended to focus on front gardens or things that actually have a more wider community benefit. So again, I don't know again if people are aware of things like the incredible edible movement that started in thank you very much. Again, that's the kind of absolutely community bottom up approach that basically just looked at tiny bits of incidental spaces in people's gardens. And I think those can be terribly powerful, terribly powerful, and in many cases, much more sustainable. So I'm definitely an advocate of that kind of thing. Yeah, definitely.
And have you ever had people actually look at the suds you're doing, say in the city centre, and say, "Can I do that in my garden?"
No, never. I think one of the things is that I think people just don't know what it is. And I think that's one of the things that we wanted to remedy was the fact that you wander around, and first of all, that if you're not educated in this, most people just read the landscape as something that either the local authority's done or not done, or it's natural. So there isn't a wide intellectual knowledge about how landscapes are formed and made. So I don't think people question things very much. So you have to actually stimulate that, through the use of events and interpretation and what have you. And then I think you start the process of how can I do this in my garden? And you definitely need to show that as well. You need to say, this is a big scale. Isn't this useful? This stops your garden being flooded in your front room. But also this is what you can do at home.
Okay, Joe, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, thank you. Well, mine was actually a comment, right? One of those dreaded comments. It was just thanking you really so much, Sue, because I've really thought it was valuable that you've been talking about things that aren't just landscape and nature, in those nice, neat categories. There have been about things like food, you talked about your cheese factory, about leisure and employment, which are all the stuff that matters, stuff that matters to communities. And I suppose if there was a question with that, it would be, have you ever had any difficulties within your sector where people have sort of said, why aren't we talking about landscape and nature? Do people ever get bothered with bringing out that real life stuff in, or do you have people you're working with who totally get that?
It's really interesting because when we started, when we very first started in the very first year, we were part of the Wildlife Trust, and we sort of changed, and we tried never to talk about landscape or nature ever to start with. We talked about what mattered to people, which was jobs at the time and a nicer place to live and maybe somewhere to play. Your kids could actually play. So we try to use the language and the things that people actually appear to want, or did actually desperately need. And through that, again, a bit like the old Trojan horse, really, we use those as the vehicle to sneak the nature bit on the side. But we always try to make the nature as acceptable as possible. We fell out with lots of ecologists in the process because it was, how do you make this kind of stuff acceptable, especially in environments where, people see maybe wilderness as lack of care and what have you. So there was an awful lot of adornment. So it's all about a spectrum. You start with this, and then of course you discover that there's more knowledge in your neighbourhood about foxes and badgers, than anywhere else. And people are passionate, but no one's ever thought that actually people, living, using a food bank and what have you, are actually, and people are passionate about the natural world, but it has to be, the relevance is really important, and you've got to be basics. If people are starving and they're just going through a drug rehabilitation program and they've just been made homeless, ranting on about, ribwort plantain. Yeah, that's what I can say.
Okay, final question then will come from Christine.
Right, it's so I recently interviewed Roger Knowles from Manor, yes, because it was one of the projects that I was involved in earlier, and my kind of thing was I was asking him about how how he'd engage people with the suds, because that was the angle I was coming in on. And he eventually said, I don't know that anybody really did. I don't know that anybody ever got it really until it flooded. So talked about it loads, and they engaged completely with the park because that's actually what something that meant something to them and they used. But it wasn't until 2007 that they went, oh, get it? We get it now. So my question really is, how relevant is it for people to actually really understand the mechanics? It's kind of like I drive my car, I don't necessarily know how it works.
I think the analogy there is actually we do know that a car gets us around, and I think actually it is really relevant that people know. But it is difficult because, of course, the time you actually see it working is when it's absolutely pouring with rain and no one goes out. And we never film it then, do we? And people never see it. So, yeah, I think it would be really helpful if people could experience it. But we'll have to find other ways than dragging them. Because even I don't go out. I mean, I force myself occasionally when it's absolutely piddling down to wade out there and just make sure and check everything is working. You know, and it's fascinating.
There's two things there. One, maybe a GoPro camera. And we do some time lapse and we put them up in big screens to show people actually what's happening when they're not going out. But the other thing, I mean, Ruth Levine is here, and she kind of like with Withers, and she was saying we should be embracing the rain. We maybe part of the longer education or the longer engagement is about actually kind of enjoying all aspects of the weather and not being shy of going out when it is piddling down.
It's like the whole thing with schools education, you know, just make sure you've got lots and lots of Wellington boots and little kind of oil skins so that everybody can get out, you know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so just to end the meeting, could I invite everybody to turn their cameras on and turn their microphones on, and I'll just give people a second to do that. And when, okay, almost there. And then could we give Sue a round of applause, please?
Thank you. That's lovely. I'm going to come back anytime you ask me now.
Thank you so much. It's been really fantastic. Okay,
Brilliant.
And thank you for coming, everybody. And we shall take your notes in the chat and act on them. So, and apologies about the technological problems at the beginning.
Lovely. Lovely to meet you all, and do get in touch. Liz, we'll be in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sue.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Everyone, bye-bye.